Strategize, but know that failure is guaranteed. Be flexible and adaptable. So I'm not a big fan of growth frameworks specifically, following them to the bone. I feel like growth is a continual process of becoming and exploring, testing different ideas. Growth isn't a static process. It's not stagnant either. It's usually very dynamic. It changes all the time, and it's usually very messy. So how this relates to startups specifically and growth is that don't be afraid to be flexible in terms of your business positioning, not just in the sense of how you market the product, for example, not just in terms of the product itself. It could be about growth, it could be about user experience, and there's a lot of prime examples of how this relates to positioning itself as a business even. So if you think of Netflix, they started out as a DVD rentals company, and then now they're a video streaming platform. Another example is Slack. Believe it or not, they used to be a web application game and now transitioned into a B2B communication tool, which is a massive pivot. And then finally, think of YouTube. It used to be initially a dating site, and now it's a massive video content streaming platform. De-risk the business. So what that means is it's easy to ideate plans for growth, but there's not a lot of emphasis in ideating ways for things not to grow or for things to fail. And the idea of de-risking the business, it's really a mentality or approach in having multiple exit plans and or strategies. So in the 7 years that I've been doing digital marketing, I've personally seen 4 startups that have failed, including my own. And I feel like there's a bit too much emphasis on startups that succeed rather than startups that have failed. And I beg to differ, where I believe that we can learn a lot more from failure than successes. So the approach is to learn about startups that have failed, start to study why they failed, start to implement those ideas within your approach to growth specifically as a startup. And that's a mental model that's going to help you de-risk the business. You're reducing the risk of it failing, essentially. While it's great to have a plan and a strategy, always have different variations of that strategy. Plan A, B, and C. With each strategy that you have, with any idea that you think could fail, start to gather those insights to then use as a defense mechanism into avoiding it from actually happening. Not just in growth specifically, but also as a startup and within your teams as a company. It's easy to be creative, and it's harder to think about that idea failing. And I feel like you can have a better idea if you can explore ways of it failing, because you can improve the idea, right? It can be a stronger idea. Growth is easy. I'll be first to admit, if you have enough of a budget and a strong enough resource or team behind you, I can make numbers go up quite easily without sounding arrogant. And that's just the nature of the world of digital marketing. There's a lot of pay-to-play aspect to it, unfortunately. It's not always the best product that wins, right? It's usually the best communicated product or the ones who take most of the market share. So an example of that would be, I could set up a Facebook ads campaign within 10 minutes, assuming that all the tech stack and creative assets are ready to go. I can start to push the numbers up by increasing spends, obviously optimizing the campaign and activity itself. While that initial KPI is easy to increase, and it's quite easy in the sense that a lot of people can do it, the concept of user retention is hard, and that's not a conversion that people talk about too much. Now, obviously that depends on the business you have, but generally speaking, user acquisition is a lot easier than user retention. Starting to think about user lifetime value as valuable as acquiring users, if not even more valuable. Growth is hard. So while some key performance indicators, KPIs, are easier to achieve, there are going to be KPIs that are difficult, almost impossible to achieve, especially if you have a very unrealistic target. Just because you have an amazing product, an amazing offer, and even an amazing market positioning, it doesn't guarantee growth. It doesn't guarantee numbers increasing all the time, month on month. The fact is, you're likely going to have competitors within your space that fairly similar proposition as you. Maybe potentially they have a stronger investment backing them, so they have a lot more budget for advertising. They have a stronger resource as a startup. There's a stronger team. There's more members, for example. Not that that dictates a better business, but accept that growth is hard. There are going to be challenges, and when those come, and they will, be up for the challenge. As I said earlier, growth is a process, and as long as you stay within that process and you're trying to figure out how to improve metrics, how to improve aspects that aren't improving, starting to think about ways to de-risk the business, you increase your chance of growth as a startup. I've consulted for quite a few startups, all the way up to companies like Meta and Audible, and the consistent theme that I tend to find is that growth is seen as a siloed responsibility. It's always someone else's responsibility. But I do feel like the idea of growth, it's a concept that needs to be spread across the company. It's really everyone's responsibility, right? at least in the world of capitalism, where the idea of a business is to continually grow, makes sense for growth to be, or a responsibility that needs to be seen as a responsibility of everyone. Doesn't matter what department they're in. If they have concepts or processes or tasks that relate to growth, that should be seen as a cross collaboration between the different teams, helping you increase your chances of growth as a startup. I'll put it in a more visual example. You could have your growth marketing team increase demand for your product, get active paying users even, but if no one's really owning the post conversion or the post awareness phase of that user, i.e. the user experience, for example, or the user interface that user goes through, and they drop off at some point in the funnel, it's harder to sustain that growth, right? And if no one's overlooking that aspect of the user journey, growth is going to be quite difficult. Hence, growth should really be communicated across the different teams. It's like, you could have a great luxurious house, the rooftop has a hole and it rains. Eventually it's going to flood, or worse, it's going to crumble. So see growth as a whole ecosystem, as the whole house. It's everyone's responsibility. It's easy to get tunnel vision and the concept of growth, especially when you start seeing numbers go up, when you start to believe that what you're doing is the right path. You might have a specific channel that's really giving you the numbers that you'd like to achieve. What you'll usually find is that path always trails off somewhere else. You can't have a channel always at an upwards trajectory. It's the same thing in business. There's a lot of external factors that will affect your growth, both at a macro and micro level. Prime example of that is at a macro level, you've got the economy, inflation rates, you've got employment/unemployment rates. On a macro level, it could be seasonality of the year, algorithm changes within the digital marketing channels that you use. And if you work within digital marketing, you know that to be true. Then finally, user psychology. What people believe now doesn't necessarily mean that they'll believe the same exact idea tomorrow. So there's external factors you have to keep in mind that will disrupt your growth. And the earlier you start to see those or forecast those happening, the likelier that your startup will succeed and grow. So what should you do? At least from my perspective as a growth marketer, first thing is make sure that growth, or the idea of growth, is spread across the teams, that is everyone's responsibility. You don't want the responsibility of growth to be siloed. Second is plan for the worst. Be flexible enough to have multiple exit strategies and plans. It's a way of de-risking the business from failing. It's a way of de-risking your growth from happening. Third is, what got you here won't necessarily get you there to your final destination. So always be testing. Don't be complacent and stagnant within your growth. And what that really boils down to is always questioning, what's our user experience like? Do we have better conversion rates on the web versus the app? Should we set our target cost per acquisition a lot higher? Should we set it lower? Should we have our advertising spend stable, or should we decrease it because we know that Christmas or Black Friday is coming up, where we know that ad impressions tend to be more expensive? And then finally, accept that growth isn't always about increasing numbers, although when we think of growth, we always think of that famous line chart going up, when in reality, growth is also about sustaining the business and sustaining the current KPIs that you have. What really matters is your user's journey, from awareness all the way up to retention. While it's great to focus on those initial KPIs that get the users in, they're seen as a valid active user and there's value to them. Obviously, there's a lot more value when you can increase that user's lifetime value. So sustaining growth is just as important as increasing the numbers. Thank you for watching the video. Until next time, peace.